Welcome back to Integrative Lyme Solutions with Dr. Karlfeldt. I am so excited about the show that we have ahead of us. We have some phenomenal information that could save lives. You're going to need to tune in to what's going on today. The information is jam-packed, so don't step away. Well, I have the pleasure today to be with Geoff Dow. He's a PhD and involved in a lot of kind of product developments and research. And this is going to be fascinating conversation. So, Geoff, thank you so much for spending some time with me today.
Thanks, Michael.
Well, so tell me a little bit. I mean, this is a Lyme podcast. Tell me a little bit, kind of what drove you towards looking at Lyme. Your journey a little bit. I know one of the things that you're really looking at is Babesia, which a lot of people are battling with. But if you don't mind, kind of sharing a little bit of the story why you got to that point.
Yeah, so it really comes back to the product that we're originally developed for malaria, and then sort of following a patient lead and where the science was taking us. So my background is in malaria drug development. I founded the company I work for at the moment, 60 Degrees Pharma, about 15 years ago. And we licensed a drug called Tafenoquine, product name Arikota, for malaria prevention from the Army, and then took it through the FDA process and got it approved for malaria. And then we put it on the market in the US right as the pandemic started, which was bad timing. It's a travel medicine product for its approved indication. COVID hit, no travel. What do you do as a small pharma company with a single product? So we did a bit of COVID work for a while, and then round about the end of 2021, we started getting these phone calls from patients saying, how can I get hold of your drug? And at the time, the description of what patients were experiencing was a bit odd to us, because we're used to dealing with healthy volunteers, travel medicine context. And, I come from a reasonably hardcore science background. And so you're used to dealing with very data-driven and empirical things. And but what we found was the patients were reading the literature, and they were seeing that our drug had been tested in animals against Babesia parasites. We didn't know it, but they knew it, that they had a co-infection of Lyme disease called Babesiosis. And that was really the first signal, more or less as the literature developed, showing better data, and as it got into the clinic with a few case studies, the patient calls sort of increased proportionally as we went along. And so about towards the end of 2023, we made a corporate decision to kind of follow that lead. And we now have 3 trials enrolling patients for babesiosis to evaluate our product. And one is specifically in chronic babesiosis. And our hope is that with data from traditional kind of severe and acute disease, which checks regulatory boxes, and then a data set from chronic disease patients, that we can kind of marry up the indications in the populations and get some labeling that will allow our drug to be used to treat babesiosis in its various forms. So that's what we're doing.
And tell me a little bit, how does malaria and Babesia, how do they are they very similar? I mean, what is the correlation between the two?
So they're both parasites that infect red blood cells. They're not identical, but in a similar way. So they use the red cell to multiply, then they burst and start a new cycle of replication and amplification. And it's that bursting of the red blood cells and then the increasing parasite burden as they multiply that causes anemia and flu-like symptoms in the acute phase of the illness. Where they're different is, and of course the vector that transmit them is different. So with malaria, it's a mosquito. With babesiosis, it's ticks. But where the key difference is with babesiosis, there's this, I don't think we even know what it is exactly, but it's some sort of latent form that hangs around for months and maybe even a couple of years. And whereas with malaria, at least the dogma is once you hit it with drugs, the bugs are gone, except for the stages that are taken up again by the mosquitoes, and they're not believed to cause any long-term symptoms. But I used to believe that about babesiosis too. So maybe there's more rocks to turn over there.
And that's the thing with these, we're learning so much about these infections and the intelligence, and we, like with Lyme disease, the thought was that, give them 2 weeks of doxycycline and then it should be gone. And obviously that has not been the case, maybe in acute, just recent infection, that's possible. But, most people suffering, they've been suffering for a long time. And, so it's the same with Babesia. And I'm curious with malaria, maybe it's similar there as well. You never know.
Well, I mean, it could be, and it could just be because, this might be a little politically incorrect, but like as North Americans or Australians, places where malaria is common is, half a world away and, not front of mind. And the people that professionally in our communities who are interested in those problems are very focused on acute disease and, parasite clearance time, fever clearance time. At day 30, have I killed all the bugs I can detect? And, they operate with the same kind of thought process as folks who study Babesia acutely do, which is, if my diagnostic is negative, there's no organisms left. And if the fever's gone, then you're better. And I always assumed that was true for malaria, and perhaps until we get, generations of scientists in tropical countries who are studying chronic things with malaria, maybe it'll be a whole different story.
Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised, and I don't disagree with you. It's hard when you're kind of half a world away from where the largest population that are battling this, than doing research, in a different location. So with Babesia, I mean, how when people were contacting you and you were kind of seeing that this may be an opportunity, were there some anecdotal evidence? Were there some people that were trying the drug on themselves and seeing anecdotally that this had an impact, or how has that process gone? With the pharmaceutical, with the drug that you're going through with trials.
Yeah. So of course, folks who've been to see 50 docs to get a diagnosis, and there's not a single product on the market with a drug label and dosing instructions specifically for your illness. Every drug you take is almost a medical experiment in a way. And so people try all kinds of things. And so I think, and the same with physicians, I think a lot of physicians in the chronic disease space are very patient-led in the way they approach prescribing. And And there's a sense of experimentation there as well. So, you know, you look in the literature the same way I would think about how to design an experiment to test a hypothesis. Patients and physicians went where the data took them. So first it was in vitro and animal studies. So a few people tried it, and then they spread the word, and there was about a 2-year gap, and then case studies started appearing in the literature with relapsing babesiosis in immunosuppressed patients. And of course, in that patient population, you need a longer treatment regimen. And so the dosing kind of practice is more similar to in a chronic illness, even though it's sort of viewed as an acute manifestation of a persistent infection. And so in 2024, there was a really nice case series that came out of Yale in immunosuppressed patients. And I think that's kind of been a bit of a backstop behind, what dosing is potentially effective, and that's also kind of supported by the safety data from the malaria program, which is all publicly, public knowledge. So, and of course, our role in that is to provide clarity on what needs to happen next to get more labeling. And so part of that is communicating our clinical trial program to different audiences. Part of it is reinforcing what's known about the safety of the product for the indication it's approved for. And so that's what we're out there talking to people about in the community.
I mean, there's been other malaria drugs, obviously, out there. How is this drug different than what's out there?
Yeah, so Tafenoquine acts as it induces oxidative stress in parasites. And so we think it works the same way against malaria as it does against Babesia. It doesn't seem to be vulnerable to resistance generation through single point mutations in the way that Tafenoquine is and azithromycin is. So it complements the existing therapies with a different mode of action, and then just being an inherently tougher drug for the parasite to evade.
So even if it's gone through some generational mutations, or it still seems to be able to go after that parasite and have an impact on it.
Yeah, so the animal data, if in an animal model, if Babesia escapes Tafenoquine treatment and then you grow it up again, the susceptibility hasn't changed. And then when they've done, intentionally generated Tafenoquine or azithromycin resistance mutations, Tafenoquine kills those bugs as well as it does the wild type bugs. And so in that way, we think it complements the existing standard of care in immunosuppressed patients. And at least in chronic babesiosis, we're evaluating monotherapy first because there is no established standard of care, and then we'll go from there depending on what the results look like.
And for babesiosis, is there currently medications that is FDA approved for that condition?
There are no drug labels that specifically target babesiosis. It's all been kind of empirically driven practice of medicine, and then the Infectious Disease Society of America has some guidelines which are helpful in acute illness, but they don't recognize chronic disease as being a real thing, and so there is no guidelines to treat a low parasite density infection that's got symptoms that overlap with other things.
Yeah, I mean, I know politically there seems to be a little bit more attention lately in regards to Lyme disease and chronic Lyme, and I would assume that hopefully this would help in the recognition of drugs that as such as yours.
I hope that the current political environment, which is more open, I hope that translates into actual meaningful funding for new treatments, diagnostics that are actually targeted on the problem, and then a regulatory pathway that's open to new ideas and practice. So what we've seen is the right thing said. What we haven't seen yet is how that translates into actual tangible things that help product developers like us.
Yeah, because
so we'll see. Is my perspective on that at the moment.
Yeah, I mean it's always proof is in the pudding. Either something is done or it's not done. I mean, we can talk about it all day long, and we appreciate the recognition. We would also like action behind the recognition as well. So how this product then is there? What have you seen? I mean, so you've done animal studies. We have some anecdotal. Sounds like there's some practitioners out there, like myself, when you deal with chronic diseases that is not clear cut. You have somebody come with staph infection, and here you give them this antibiotic, or come with this infection, you give them that medication. It's very kind of clear cut, but a lot of times with these chronic diseases, it's quite a bit up to the provider in regards to how to navigate that, and then maybe do then therapies that may not be so standard of care, so to say. So what results have been reported? Obviously you're going through the study, so we don't know quite yet what the study will show. But what has been communicated to you, and what have you seen through animal studies so far?
So what we've seen so far is, we put out a press release. So one of our studies is an expanded access study in immunosuppressed relapsing patients with that's intended to replicate what Yale found in their 5-patient case series. And we're combining the approved regimen of our product with a combination of azithromycin and atovaquone. And then at the end of the study, we do, we provide the drug at no charge. There's a small administrative compensation for the investigator and the patient for the time. And then the key bit of data that we get in return for that at the end of the study is we use the blood bank's Babesiosis test to screen yes or no, is the infection still present? And for context, that blood bank test is 500 times more sensitive than a standard PCR that you might order from LabQuest or one of the big commercial pathology chains. And after they introduced it, the rate of blood-borne transmission of babesiosis has basically gone to zero. And so what that test shows you is that two things. If you're a blood donor, you're asymptomatic, right? So there's a meaningful parasite burden in a whole bunch of people that they didn't even know about it. And then the second thing is it's screening out a meaningful biological number of organisms. So if you test negative in that screen, then as far as we can tell, you're not infected with Babesia anymore. So our first data point out of that study is that first patient that went through the protocol tested negative in that test. And so we think that the regimen we used is curative. And we have 2 more patients who will come off that study in the next couple of months. And we're hopeful we'll see the same outcome in them as well. And then even if we don't have all the data yet we need for a label change, it's a pretty good signal that we're on the right track. And then we have the 2 other studies, a randomized hospital study looking at that same triple regimen compared to standard of care in hospitalized patients, and then a separate study in chronic disease with monotherapy. And then hopefully we see similar anti-parasite trends across all 3 of them. And then to your point about what endpoints do you use for chronic disease, in our chronic babesiosis study, we decided to use a patient-reported outcome as the primary endpoint. And we're using what's called the multidimensional fatigue inventory as the quantitative way of measuring patients' perception of how fatigue is affecting their life. And, I think probably investors and FDA think it's a bit of a squishy endpoint, but it's always felt to me like the most relevant. Of course, there's 100 different fatigue inventories, so you could have picked a different one. But ultimately, for these chronic diseases, the patient has to be the best judge of whether they're, feeling better or they're not. So we'll see what happens. Like I don't know what the outcome will be, but we're hopeful based on the anecdotal reports we've gotten from patients and physicians over the last couple of years that there's some there, and ultimately the data will speak for itself.
And do you mind sharing a little bit, kind of what the results are? I mean, patients, they come, I feel from 0 to 10, my energy level is 2, and then doing the drug, now my energy level is at 7. I mean, what has been reported so far, so the listeners can understand a little bit what.
Yeah, so we've enrolled 2 patients so far. So it started at the end of December. We've enrolled 2 patients so far. I don't know. They're doing well as far as I know, but I don't know any specific numbers or changes. And it's a bit early to be too communicative about that, because we obviously don't want to bias the outcome. But for, at some level, where I think this is the first chronic babesiosis trial that's ever been done. So we're very proud of that. I'm almost 100% certain it's the first one that was reviewed under an IND by the FDA. Super proud of that. And then really happy that we got the first 2 patients through the first 60 days without too much drama. And so all of those are pretty important first in the field. And so now we're trying to increase the enrollment and then at some point, hopefully, we'll have some data that we can share anecdotally, but also publish and get in the literature so that people can make up their own minds.
And when you say increased enrollment, are you looking for people to volunteer in that are battling with chronic babesiosis, or is that a challenge in any way?
There are lots of patients, but we only have one site in New York at the moment at Mount Sinai. And so it's a little bit of a challenge just with, you can only go at a certain pace. And then the patients have to meet the, fairly precise criteria to get into the study. And so that part of it's challenging. And then, of course, if you wanted to increase enrollment in a predictable way, you would open multiple sites. But the challenge there is you can't just take a regular clinical research site that enrolls, patients with an E. coli infection and expect them to be able to interact and treat chronic disease patients in the way that needs to be done in the right way. And I know everyone who's listening knows exactly what I'm talking about, but I can't explain it more articulately than that. So the challenge is you need researchers with a rigorous academic clinical trial background. And then you need to combine that in the Venn diagram with having the appropriate level of compassion and experience in having dealt with and treated chronic disease patients. And there are very few places that meet both those criteria. And so even if you can find the sites, then, your study becomes 10 times more expensive. Mm-hmm. So at the moment, we're just going slow with, patients within the catchment area of Mount Sinai. And then as we get a little bit further along, we might explore ways to expand it to perhaps out of state, but we're not quite there yet.
And so, originally it was designed, like you're saying, for malaria, travel disease, and with that, you just do, I assume, just kind of a short burst of the medication. Here with chronic, then I would assume that the dosage is, for a longer period of time. Were there any kind of concerns in adverse reactions in the short burst for malaria? And then also, did that translate or did not translate into the long term? What were some of the concerns maybe in regards to adverse reactions of the medication?
It's actually the opposite, because prophylactic malaria medications have to be taken continuously to be effective. So that the longer you're away, the longer you take a drug for. So the drug was actually designed with weekly dosing in mind, so to improve compliance. And then we've got, randomized placebo-controlled safety studies out to a year with weekly dosing and shown a pretty good safety profile relative to placebo. So if you think about a chronic disease where you might need, 3 to 6 months to eradicate the organism, and certainly at least 60 days to see clear symptomatic relief, then actually that weekly dosing and safety profile is, pretty aligned with that therapeutic goal. I think where we're concerned on the adverse event side is, and this is why we go to conferences and communicate about our safety data, is FDA approved that dosing regimen for a reason. Like, we had lots of data. They made us go and do rigorous studies. And higher doses have a lot less data, but people like to push the dose. And so while being respectful of who has the authority to make decisions about individual patients, we don't encourage, deviating from what's been well studied. And so that's a concern as an organization, is, people pushing the dose too high. And then the specific thing we worry about is, Tafenoquine is a drug that predictably causes met hemoglobin, an elevation in met hemoglobin. It usually dissipates over time, even if you're still taking the drug weekly. So it's a transient effect. But the higher you go with the dose, the more of that you see. And so we worry about that a little bit, but more as a motivation to get the message out about where the dosing in healthy patients has been, well studied.
And so the Yale study, I mean, what was the dosage that was done in the Yale study that you referred to?
Yeah, so this is where I have to get a little bit mealy-mouthed and just remind everyone that Tafenoquine is approved for malaria prevention. There is no formal guidance on how to use the product from our friends at FDA, and there is no conclusive evidence of safety and efficacy in this disease. What Yale decided was the right dose was a 600 milligram loading dose and then 300 milligrams a week. And it looked like from their data set that if you gave that regimen weekly for at least 9 weeks and you combined it with 2 other standard of care drugs, that seemed to work pretty well. I don't think you need a dose. I don't think you need 300 a week, and that's based on, experience with where we think the effective dose is with malaria and then comparing the animal data for the 2 diseases. And so that, and because we understand the safety data much better, in our own confirmatory studies, we chose to work with the 200 milligram dose every week that's been used and approved for malaria prevention. And again, that's because it's been well studied from a safety perspective, and the animal data and some other things suggest it should be quite effective.
And that's without the loading dose like they were doing.
Well, yeah, I mean, we've taken so with malaria prevention, the idea is to get to steady state. So you give 5 or 6 doses of Tafenoquine, and it doesn't really matter on what the timeline is. Eventually, you're going to get to steady state and then maintain it. So, a lot of folks with chronic disease, you have to manage the Herxheimer reaction as a practical, reaction to a new drug. It's just kind of a fact of life. So in a patient that's had that experience before, you're probably not going to give a loading dose. So in acute disease where you're trying to get the organism count down quickly, then I think a loading dose is essential. In a chronic disease where you're not going to see the fatigue endpoint move meaningfully for a period of time, and it's a low organism burden, I think you have more room to move. So in our Mount Sinai study, we've left the issue of a loading dose or how much loading dose to the discretion of the investigators. And that's kind of how clinical practice is anyway, is you have an individual patient come in and everyone's different. And so you make a dose selection based on what makes sense for your patient and then go from there.
Yeah, I love that. And yes, I want to just kind of reiterate to the audience, even though we're talking about this drug in babesiosis, it is in clinical trials, so it has not been approved for that use yet. It doesn't mean though that, under a physician's care that is trained, then, sometimes they repurpose drugs, for other usages other than what it was originally intended for. And so it is exciting, to have a new drug coming out, that's been used for another purpose, and then seeing its benefit in something that a lot of the Lyme sufferers are struggling with. Babesiosis obviously is a big deal with the fatigue and it's a big deal. So I'm very, very excited about this. And Geoff, where can people go to kind of learn more as the trials are developing and kind of and keep an eye on when this is coming out and where it's at in the approval process?
So our website's probably the best place. So 60degreespharma.com. And because we're a NASDAQ listed company, we're reasonably communicative to the investment community with press releases. And so, if you follow our press releases, you'll get a good sense of kind of where the company's at with various things.
Well, Geoff, thank you so much. And this is very, very exciting. I mean, first trial for chronic babesiosis, and be potentially the first FDA approval for that condition. So this is very, very exciting. Thank you so much for moving this forward and giving lots of people hope out there that are struggling with this challenging condition. So thank you so much, Geoff, and for what you're doing and for taking this time chatting with me today.
My pleasure, and looking forward to talking with you again in the future.
Thank you so much. The information in this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not designed to diagnose or treat any disease. I hope this podcast impacted you as it did me. Please subscribe so that you can be notified when new episodes are released. There are some excellent shows coming up that you do not want to miss. If you're enjoying these podcasts, please take a moment to write a review, and please don't keep this information to yourself. Share them with your family and friends. You never know what piece of information that will transform their lives. For past episodes and powerful information on how to conquer Lyme, go to integrativelymeSolutions.com, and an additional powerful resource, lymestream.com. For Lyme support and group discussions, join Lyme Conquerors Mentoring Lyme Warriors on Facebook. If you'd like to know more about the cutting-edge integrative Lyme therapies my center offers, please visit thekarlfeldtcenter.com. Thank you for spending this time with us, and I hope to see you at our next episode of Integrative Lyme Solutions with Dr. Karlfeldt.